Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever thought about the really intricate rules governing something as basic as, well, a job contract?
Mm,
Not just today's law, but frameworks from ancient, really deeply considered legal thinking.
absolutely.
Today, we're diving into a fascinating set of sources, specifically Sharia Standard Known 34, that lay out these precise principles for what they call leasing of persons.
Which is essentially, employment, hiring someone.
Exactly, employment.
And what's really striking here, I think, is how this standard gives such a meticulous blueprint for these agreements.
Meticulous is the word.
It really pushes you to think critically about fairness, about responsibility in ways that honestly feel relevant even now. They transcend time.
For sure. So our mission today is to pull out the key nuggets, the really important bits from this document. We want to break down the distinctions, the duties, even some surprising details in these contracts.
Yeah, there are definitely some aha moments in there.
Okay, so let's start with the core idea, this leasing of persons.
Right. Fundamentally, it just refers to an employment or service contract, where someone's labor, their skill is leased out for a specific job or for a set time.
But what jumped out at me immediately is how it draws a sharp line between two different types of employees right from the start.
That's a key distinction. First, you have the specific employee.
Okay.
This is where the contract is with one particular person for their exclusive service. Think of hiring that specific expert.
Right. And clarity is paramount here, isn't it? You need specifics.
Exactly. The contract needs to spell out the duration, how long the lease lasts, and the general nature of the work. What are they actually doing?
What if they forget to mention the duration or just don't specify?
Ah, interesting point. If the duration isn't explicitly stated, then the standard says common local practice or custom basically fills in that blank.
So local norms take over. Makes sense. And their liability, how responsible are they if something goes wrong?
It's quite specific. Generally, they don't incur liability. Yeah, unless they actively commit a transgression or they're negligent or they, violate a specific condition laid out in the contract. Otherwise, the risk isn't primarily on them for accidental damage, say.
Okay, so a fairly high bar for them to be held responsible.
Precisely. And this connects directly to their pay. For a specific employee, their remuneration, their wage, it's only considered fully earned after they complete all the work for the entire lease duration.
The whole period.
The whole period. It puts the onus on them to fulfill the term, but, it also implies the employer needs to maintain conditions that allow that.
Okay, that's the specific employee. Exclusive service, defined duration, specific liability. How does the common employee contrast with that?
The common employee is different. They're usually hired for a specific task or a certain type of work. Think piecework or hiring a tradesperson for a job. Their service isn't necessarily exclusive.
So less about the person, more about the job itself.
Exactly. Clarity here comes from specifying the work itself, describing it well, and defining its type.
Can you still set a time limit for them, even if it's task-based?
Yes, interestingly, it's permissible to also add a duration to a common employee's contract, even though the main focus is the task.
And liability for them, I recall, is quite different.
It is. Generally, the common employee is liable for destruction or damage to the work or materials.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The major exception is if there's some kind of overwhelming general event, something unavoidable, like a natural disaster that they couldn't possibly prevent.
So a much broader liability compared to the specific employee. That's a really clear contrast.
Definitely shapes the nature of the engagement.
Okay, so we've got these two types sketched out. Now the big question, once you make one of these agreements, how solid is it? Can someone just, change their mind and walk away?
Good question. The standard emphasizes that these contracts are binding.
Binding, okay.
Neither side can just unilaterally break it off without a proper reason.
So what counts as a proper reason?
Well, there are specific conditions for termination. First, if there's a breach of conditions, someone didn't hold up their end of the bargain.
Makes sense.
Second, if an unforeseen excuse arises, something unexpected that makes doing the work impossible or, unreasonably difficult.
Like what, for example?
Could be many things, depends on the context. Maybe illness or a sudden inability to access the work site for reasons beyond control.
Okay. And the third?
Force majeure, those big, overpowering, unavoidable events we mentioned earlier. Think major floods, war, things like that.
Got it. So breach, unforeseen excuse, or force majeure.
Correct. And there's one more specific to the the specific employee.
Ah,
Since the contract is tied to them personally, it also terminates if that specific employee loses their eligibility or capacity to actually do the work, like if a surgeon injures their hands permanently.
that follows logically from the nature of their contract.
Okay. What about renewals? Do these things just roll over? No, not automatically. The standard is quite clear. If you want to renew for another period, there needs to be a notification, a clear signal of that desire.
So you have to actively agree to continue.
Exactly. No notification, no automatic extension. It requires a conscious decision.
All right. We've covered the types, the binding nature, how contracts end. But let's get to the really crucial part for many people. The wages. Al-Ujra. This framework has some, let's say, intriguing rules about payment. And there's one prohibition that really jumps out right away.
Absolutely. It's quite striking. It is explicitly not permissible to stipulate an increase in the wage if payment is delayed.
No late fees.
Yeah.
No interest on overdue wages.
Correct. No stipulated increase for lateness. It's a fundamental prohibition against what resembles interest in this context. It forces you to think differently about penalties for default.
Wow. That's very different from typical modern contracts. So if you can't charge extra for late payment, what is the mechanism if an employer defaults? Is there one?
Yes, and this is where it gets really unique, I think. The contract can include a clause for default.
Okay.
But instead of a penalty fee going to the employee, the clause stipulates that the defaulting employer pledges to donate a specified amount, or maybe a percentage of the wage.
Donate.
Yes, donate it to charity.
Wait, hang on. So instead of paying a late fee to the employee, the penalty for the employer paying late is a mandatory charitable donation.
Precisely. It's an obligation they undertake in the contract itself. If they default, they promise to give this amount to charity.
That's fascinating. What's the thinking there?
Well, the idea is that the penalty doesn't enrich the other party purely because of the delay, which could resemble interest. Instead, it serves a social good. The funds must be spent on legitimate charitable causes, often under the supervision of a Shari'ah board, to ensure it happens correctly.
So it redirects the consequence towards benefiting the community rather than just compensating the individual for the delay itself.
Exactly. It shifts the focus.
Okay, that's one major point on wages. This then leads us to another really interesting concept. Varying wages, or tardid al-ujra. This sounds flexible.
It is remarkably flexible. It shows a lot of adaptability. What it means is that it's permissible to set different wage levels based on certain conditions being met.
Like what?
The most common example is time. You can set a specific higher amount if the work gets done within a certain shorter time frame.
Ah, like a bonus for finishing early.
Sort of, yeah. And conversely, you can stipulate a lower amount if the work takes longer than that specified time.
So it directly incentivizes speed and efficiency. That seems incredibly practical.
Very practical. And it's not just about time. This variable structure can also be tied to where the work is done maybe a higher rate for a more difficult location,
Okay.
or involving two different types of work within the same contract, maybe paid differently, or even requiring two different specialties from the employee.
You know, that level of built-in variable incentive is something you don't often see spelled out so clearly in standard modern contracts. They tend to be more fixed rate or hourly.
Right. It allows for quite granular, pre-agreed adjustments based on performance or conditions. It makes you wonder about the kinds of complex projects this was designed to handle.
Definitely. Okay, so variable wages are allowed. What about just the basic payment schedule? When is the wage actually due?
The parties have flexibility here too. Wages can be stipulated to be paid in advance, deferred entirely until the end, or paid in installments. It's based on their agreement.
And if they don't agree on a specific timing, what's the default?
Good question. If there's no specific agreement, the default rule kicks in. The wage is due after the service is completed, and the employer can actually benefit from it.
Makes sense. Get the work, then pay.
Right. Or, for a specific employee tied to a duration, it's due when that duration expires.
And what if the employer doesn't pay when it's due, even after being asked? Does the employee have any recourse?
Yes, absolutely. If the employer fails to pay upon demand when the wage is due, the employee gains a specific right.
Which is?
They have the right to refuse to continue working, or even to actively prevent the employer from benefiting from the service or work already done until payment is made.
So they can essentially withhold their labor or its results? That's pretty direct leverage.
It is. It provides a clear, immediate tool for the employee to secure payment that's owed.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the employer's duty to pay. But obligations run both ways. Let's flip it. What about the employer's other responsibilities?
Well, besides paying the wage as agreed, advanced, deferred, installments, whatever the deal was,
Right.
the other main obligation is providing necessities for the work. If the nature of the job requires specific tools, materials, or supplies, the employer generally has to provide them. Unless it was explicitly stipulated otherwise in the contract, or if custom dictates the employee provides their own tools for that particular trade, for instance. But the default is often on the employer if the work itself demands it.
Okay, so provide payment and necessary tool supplies.
Huh.
Got it. Now let's turn to the employee's obligations. For the specific employee, the one hired exclusively for a period, what are their key duties?
Their main duty is to dedicate their full service to that employer for the agreed duration.
Full service, meaning
Meaning they generally can't be absent without permission. They need to be available and working for that employer throughout the contract period, unless there's a recognized excuse, like a religious duty or, genuine illness, perhaps. Their time belongs to that employer.
right, that exclusivity is key. And for the common employee, the task-oriented one.
Their primary obligation is simpler in one sense. Complete the work as agreed. Deliver the outcome.
Get the job done.
Exactly. If a duration was also specified in their contract, they need to adhere to that too, but the main focus is successfully completing the task they were hired for.
Now, a practical question. Does the employee always have to do the work personally? Can they subcontract or get someone else to do it?
Ah, good point. The general rule, especially if the contract is for a specific work required from them personally.
Like hiring a specific artist for a portrait.
Precisely. In that case, the employee generally must perform the work themselves. Their personal skill is what was contracted for.
But there are exceptions.
Yes. Two main ones. First, if the contract explicitly says that delegation or subcontracting is allowed.
Okay, if it's written in.
Second, if the lease defines the work by its outcome rather than requiring personal performance, sometimes called defining it in kind. If the goal is just get this built or get this cleaned and the contract doesn't specify who must do it, then delegation might be permissible. It depends heavily on how the work is defined.
That's a crucial distinction, outcome versus personal performance.
Okay.
And one more thing on obligations. Penalty clauses. We see them all the time in modern contracts, especially for delays. Are they allowed here?
Yes. The standard says it is permissible to include a penalty clause in these leasing contracts.
For what kind of things?
Most commonly mentioned is for delays in completing the work on time.
Okay, so you can have a penalty for lateness by the employee, even if the employer can't charge extra for paying late. Interesting symmetry or lack thereof.
Well, it's structured differently. The key condition for the employee penalty clause, though, is that the amount needs to be determined by custom and fairness.
So it can't be excessive or punitive. It needs to be reasonable.
Exactly. It should reflect a fair assessment of the actual harm or inconvenience caused by the delay, guided by what's considered normal or fair in that context, not just an arbitrary number.
So, stepping back and looking at the whole picture, all these detailed rules about types of employees, binding conditions, wage structures, obligations, even penalties. What does it tell us overall?
Well, I think if you connect it to the bigger picture, these standards really show a highly developed, quite sophisticated legal framework for employment. It clearly values clarity above all, clarity in roles, in duration, and payment, and mutual obligation is central. It also provides, as we saw, some pretty ethical guidance for managing disputes or defaults, like the charity pledge.
Right. It's not just a list of rules, is it? It seems to be aiming for a certain kind of fairness, a balance of responsibility.
Exactly. It's about building these employment relationships on clearly defined terms and mutual responsibilities.
Which really makes you think, what does this all mean for us today?
Yeah.
When we consider these traditional yet incredibly detailed approaches, especially things like the varying wages based on time or that charitable pledge for late payments, how might these sort of historical insights influence how we think about modern contracts? Or even just challenge our understanding of what makes an employment agreement feel truly equitable or robust, or maybe even ethically grounded?
That's a great question. Does the focus on things other than simple monetary penalties for default offer something valuable? Does the explicit allowance for incentivizing efficiency through wages hold lessons?
Yeah, lots to chew on there. That's definitely a provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We've certainly taken quite a deep dive today.